The signals from the planet below had been producing the anomalous data for 18 months before his arrival, and for 5 months since, and they had not yet produced the interpretation that the anomalous data was asking for. This was the most interesting research problem he had encountered in 7 years of the research function. He had been in the research function for 7 years. The Joint Authorities Scientific Investigation Program, the postings that the program placed its research specialists in across the frontier zone's expanding engagement territory. The previous postings had the quality of the previous problems: the significant, the technically demanding, the genuinely important. None of them had the quality of the problem that the planet below Karath 3 was producing, which was the quality of the problem that resisted the standard analytical frameworks and which required the combination of approaches that the two-person configuration provided. The two-person configuration. He had been in the two-person configuration for 5 months. The other person in the configuration was Thessaly Veen. He had read the bilateral program's briefing materials on the Sorvin species with the attention of the research specialists' pre-posting preparation, the thorough reading, the specific understanding of the perceptual capabilities that the briefing documented, the preparation for working with a partner whose function included the perceptual capacities that the briefing described as the most significant contribution to the joint research program. The briefing described the Sorvin's perceptual function accurately. The briefing's accuracy was the accuracy of the documentation that had been assembled from the outside, the account of the function and its parameters and its significance for the joint research program. The briefing described what the Sorvin perceptual function was and what it did and why it was relevant to the research work. The briefing had not described what it was like to work alongside it. He had been finding this out for 5 months. The station was the specific environment of the deep research posting, the two-person configuration in the sustained isolation above the unexplored world, the research infrastructure that the Joint Authorities Scientific Program had placed in orbit to investigate the planet's anomalous signal emissions. The station was functional and compact and oriented entirely around the research function. The instruments, the analysis systems, the communication infrastructure, the specific design of a facility that was built for the work and which had provided for the people doing the work with the specific practicality of the Joint Authorities' deep posting facilities. He had been in the station for 5 months. She had been in the station for 8 months. She had arrived 3 months before his rotation in the configuration's previous iteration, and had continued in the current configuration with the specific continuity of someone who had been in the research problem for 8 months, and who had the accumulated understanding that 8 months produced. The accumulated understanding was extensive. Her accumulated understanding of the signals was extensive. Her accumulated understanding of him was also extensive, though he had not known the extent of the latter understanding for most of the 5 months. He was learning the extent now. He had been learning it for the 3 months that the managing had been the most significant ongoing effort in his daily function. The 3 months of the careful professional register and the maintained research priority and the specific discipline of someone who had understood the situation and had determined the management as the appropriate response. The management was the response to the thing he had not anticipated when he had read the briefing materials and had prepared for the posting's function. The thing he had not anticipated was the 5 months. The 5 months of the research work, and the shared significant problem, and the two-person configuration's specific proximity, and the quality of her attention in the research function, and the quality of her presence in the informal hours, and the specific thing that the 5 months had produced in him that he had been managing for 3 of them. He had been managing carefully. He had understood the cultural distance, and the responsibilities and the professional relationships appropriate form, and the specific consideration that the Sorvain's documented perceptual capabilities required in the professional context. He had managed with the full quality of the understanding. He had been finding, in the 3rd month's accumulated management, that the management was both the appropriate thing and the most demanding thing in the station's current operational context. The signals from the planet continued to produce the anomalous data. The work continued. He continued. The research work had the quality of the genuinely interesting problem sustained over time. This was the specific quality that differentiated the genuinely interesting from the merely significant, the sustaining. The genuinely interesting problem held the attention not because it demanded the attention, but because the attention wanted to be in the problem, because the problem kept producing the next layer of the interesting thing, as the previous layer was understood. The planet's signal emissions had this quality. The emissions had the surface layer, the specific frequency, patterns that the standard analytical frameworks had been addressing for 18 months before his arrival, and which had produced the documentation of the surface layer's characteristics. The surface layer was significant, and the surface layer's documentation was thorough, and the surface layer was not the interesting part. The interesting part was what the surface layer was carrying. He had identified this in the second month. The specific analytical observation that the surface layer's patterns had the structure of the carrier rather than the structure of the signal itself. That the anomalous data the surface layer produced was anomalous because the analysis was treating the carrier as the signal. He had brought this to the morning's research session. She had said, yes. She had said it with the quality of someone who had been circling the same understanding from the perceptual function's direction and who had found, in his analytical approach, the precise meeting point where the two approaches produced the thing neither had produced alone. They had been in the correct relationship since the second month. The correct relationship was the relationship of the two approaches that produced the combination: his signal analysis, her perceptual pattern recognition, the specific quality of the combination that was more than the sum of the individual approaches. The combination had produced the most significant research progress in the station's 18 months of operation. The Joint Authorities' research oversight had communicated this in the fifth month's first week. The formal acknowledgement of the research progress's significance. The recognition that the current configuration's combination had achieved what the previous configurations had not. He had received the acknowledgement with the quality of someone who found the work genuinely important and who was in the work's importance with the full quality of his engagement. He had also been in the 3 months managing. The managing had begun in the second month's end. The specific moment in the research work when the combination had produced the significant finding, and he had looked at her in the finding's presence, and the looking had produced the understanding that he had been building for 2 months without knowing he was building it. The understanding was, he had developed the thing he had been managing for 3 months. He had understood this, and he had immediately understood the management's necessity, and he had begun the management. The management's instruments were the professional register, the research function's priority, the specific attention to the appropriate form of the two-person configuration's working relationship. The instruments were effective in the explicit dimension. The morning sessions and the analysis work and the documentation had the professional quality that the management produced. The instruments were not effective in the dimension that the briefing had documented. He had known this from the beginning of the management. He had known that the Sorvain's perceptual function was reading the things that the professional register could not conceal: the tones shifts, the postures changes, the physiological indicators that the body produced independently of his intention. He had known that the management was visible to the function it was trying to manage around. He had managed anyway. He had managed because the alternative was the unmanaged expression of the thing, and the unmanaged expression was not the appropriate form for the professional relationship in the two-person configuration of the deep research posting, and the appropriate form was what the cultural distance and the responsibilities required. He had been in the appropriate form for 3 months. He had been finding, in the third month's later weeks, that the appropriate form was the most significant effort in his current daily function, and that the most significant effort was not the research work. This was the information he was managing. In the afternoons, the station's informal hours, the time that the deep posting required for the sustained human function, the time that was not the research work but the working's context. They had the specific quality of two people who had been in the shared significant work for the accumulated months, and who were in the informal time with the accumulated months quality. She asked him about Earth. He told her about Earth. She told him about Sorvain. He listened with the quality of the genuine interest. The genuine interest was the instrument of the managing and also the genuine thing, both simultaneously, which was the specific difficulty of the managing in the presence of the genuine thing. At the 4th month's midpoint, she said, the signal's carrier layer has the specific structure of the intentional pattern rather than the natural emission pattern. He said, yes, I've been building the case for the intentional structure for 3 weeks. She said, the intentional structure requires the intentional source. He said, yes, she said, the intentional source requires the reconsideration of the preliminary findings characterization of the planet. He said, yes. The preliminary findings characterization assumed the uninhabited. She said, yes. He said, yes. They had been in the research work's most significant finding for 2 minutes, and he had been in the finding with the full quality of his research function's engagement, and he had also been in the 4th month's managing, and the finding's significance and the managing had been present simultaneously in the same moment, and he had managed. She had looked at him at the findings moment. He had looked at the analysis display. He had managed. The observation dome was the station's primary viewing space. The dome had the quality of the deep posting specific provision. The design element that the Joint Authorities Research Facility architects had learned to include in the 2-person configuration specifications. The space that provided the direct view of the research subject below and the deep space beyond, and which provided, in the providing, the specific quality of perspective that the sustained research isolation required. He came to the dome in the evening's informal hours with the quality of the 5 months' accumulated presence in the dome's specific ambient. The planet below in the dome's primary viewport, the deep space in the surrounding field, the specific quality of the direct engagement with the scale of the thing they were in. She came to the dome, he said, the carrier layer analysis from the afternoon. I've been thinking about the intentional structure's implications. She said, yes. She said it in the register that was not the research register. He noted this. She sat at the dome's secondary observation position, the position adjacent to the one he occupied, the position of the 2-person dome configuration. She said, I want to tell you something. He said, yes. He said it in the register of someone who was managing the moment's quality and who was in the managing with the full quality of the 3 months' practice. She said, I've known for approximately 3 months. The managing held. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the information, and who was receiving the information with the full quality of the 3 months' accumulated preparation for this specific information's arrival. She said, I want to explain how I know because the how is the important part. Not the fact of the knowing. You have known that the Sorvin's perceptual function makes the knowing possible. The how is what I want you to understand. He said, yes. She said the briefing materials describe the function's parameters. The tone shifts, the posture changes, the physiological indicators. The documentation is accurate as far as it goes. He said, yes. She said, what the documentation doesn't describe is the experience of the functions reading over the extended duration. He said, yes. She said, the 1st month's reading produced the professional relationships profile, the signal analysis specialist's approach to the research function, the working style, the specific quality of the engagement with the problem. The standard professional profile. He said, yes. She said, the 2nd month's reading began to produce the additional layer. He said, yes. She said, the additional layer arrived gradually. The perceptual function doesn't produce the single moment of revelation. It produces the accumulation. The accumulation of the subtle indicators across time is the reading's instrument. He said, yes. I understand the mechanism. She said the specific indicators in the 2nd month. The attention patterns shifted. The quality of the attention you directed at the research work and the quality of the attention in the informal hours began to diverge. He said, yes. She said, the professional attention remained consistent. The research work had the full quality of the engagement throughout. The informal hours' attention had the additional quality. He said, yes. She said, the additional quality was the attention that was present and also managing its presence. He said, yes. She said, the managing is visible to the perceptual function as the managing. The professional register maintained deliberately is different from the professional register that is the natural expression of the professional relationship. The deliberate maintenance has the specific quality of the effort. He said, yes, I know. She said, you have known that the managing was visible. He said, yes. She said, and you managed anyway. He said, yes. She said, I want to tell you why I understand that. He said, yes. She said, the cultural distance is real. I know it from the Sorvin's history with the bilateral relationship, the history of the misunderstandings that the cultural distance produced, and which the cultural distance's acknowledgement has been the work of the bilateral relationship's development. You managed because the managing was the respectful form. He said, yes. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of the significant thing acknowledged. She said, and the managing also had a cost. He said, yes. She said, the managing's cost was the thing the managing prevented. He said, yes, yes. The thing the managing prevented was the appropriate form's requirement. She said, yes, I know. She said, I want to tell you what the perceptual function produced when it read the managed thing over 3 months. He said, yes. She said, the managed thing is she found the word intense. The genuine thing that is being managed is more visible to the perceptual function than the expressed thing. The suppression makes the signal cleaner. He said, yes. He said, I didn't know that. She said, the documentation doesn't describe it. The documentation describes the perceptual function's general parameters. The specific quality of the managed signal, the signal that is being carefully contained, is the most clear signal the perceptual function reads. He said, yes. She said, because the managing directs the energy of the genuine thing inward rather than outward, and the inward direction produces the concentrated physiological expression that the perceptual function reads at the highest resolution. He said, the managing made it more visible. She said, yes. He said, I was trying to make it less visible. She said, yes, I know, he said, and I made it more visible. She said, yes. He was quiet for the duration of the significant thing received. She said, yes, she said it with the quality of the gentle acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of someone who was in the significant moment with the full quality of the care the significant moment required. He said, the 3 months. She said, yes. He said, you've been in the 3 months with the perceptual functions reading. She said, yes. He said, and you said nothing. She said, yes. He said, why? She said, I want to tell you the account of the 3 months from my perspective. Not the perceptual functions account. The account of the person who was in the 3 months with the perceptual functions reading and who was making decisions about what to do with the reading. He said, yes. She said, the first month of the reading, the second month of the posting, produced the understanding of what the reading was producing. The additional layer, the managed signal, the specific quality of the genuine thing being carefully contained. He said, yes. She said, the understanding's arrival required the decision. The perceptual function gives information. The information requires the decision of what to do with the information. He said, yes. She said, the first decision I considered was the direct address. The immediate communication of the reading's content, what the perceptual function was producing, what it meant, the direct conversation. He said, yes. She said, I decided against it. He said, why? She said, the direct address would have given you the information that the perceptual function had produced without giving you the choice of whether to make the information available. The perceptual function's reading is not your communication. The perceptual function read what you were containing. The containing was your choice. The communication of the contained thing should also be your choice. He said, yes. He said, the decision was mine to make. She said, yes. The perceptual function gave me the information. The information was mine to have. The decision about what to do with the contained thing was yours to make. He said, yes. She said, the second decision I considered was the waiting. The waiting for you to make the decision, to move from the managing to the communication when you were ready to make that movement. He said, and you chose the waiting. She said, I chose the waiting. Yes, he said, 3 months. She said, 3 months. Yes, he said, he found the word patient. She said, the Sorvin's perceptual function produces the patience. When you have the information before the person is ready to communicate it, the patience is the appropriate form. He said, yes, she said, and the waiting produced the observation. He said, yes. She said, 3 months of the observation, the managed signal across 3 months. The research work's progress and the informal hours and the dome's evenings and the managing present in all of it. He said, yes. She said, I want to tell you what I found in 3 months of the observation. He said, yes. She said, the managing was consistent. The quality of the managing across 3 months, the professional register, the research function's priority, the discipline was consistent. Not the consistency of the managed performance, the consistency of the genuine commitment to the appropriate form. He said, yes. She said, the genuine commitment to the appropriate form is she found the word unusual. He said, yes. She said, the perceptual function reads the managing as the effort. The effort has the quality of its motivation. The motivation of the managing across 3 months was the cultural distance and the responsibilities and the professional relationships appropriate form. He said, yes. She said, the motivation was not the concealment of the thing from my perception. You knew the concealment was not achievable. He said, no. I knew the concealment wasn't achievable, she said. The motivation was the respect for the appropriate form. He said, yes, yes. The managing was for the appropriate form. She said, I know. She said, the perceptual function reads the motivation as clearly as the signal. The 3 months produced the clear reading of the motivation. He said, yes. She said, I want to tell you what the motivation's reading produced in me. He said, yes. She said, The motivation of the respect for the appropriate form, the genuine commitment to the cultural distance and the responsibilities, is the quality I was looking for. He said, yes, she said. The Sorvin's history with the bilateral relationships development has produced the specific understanding of what the quality of the genuine engagement looks like across the cultural distance. The genuine engagement that acknowledges the cultural distance and manages the appropriate form from the motivation of the respect rather than the motivation of the management. He said, yes, she said. The 3 months produced the clear reading of the genuine engagement. He said, yes, she said, and tonight. He said, yes, she said, tonight you are going to leave the dome and manage again, and the managing will continue and the decision will remain unmade for the remaining months of the station posting. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the accurate description of what he was going to do and who was in the accurate description with the full quality of its accuracy. She said, I know, she said. I've been watching the pattern for 3 months. Tonight was going to be the dome and the conversation and the managing and the departure. He said, yes. He said, you're right. She said, yes. He said, I'm not going to leave the dome and manage again. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of someone who had been waiting for the specific thing and who was in the specific thing's arrival in the genuine quality of the arrival. He said, the 3 months. She said, yes, he said. I was managing because the managing was the appropriate form. She said, yes, I know, he said, and the managing was visible. She said, yes, he said, and the managing made the signal cleaner. She said, yes, he said. I managed for 3 months and produced the clearest possible signal. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the significant thing and who was finding in the significant thing the specific combination of the considerable and the slightly absurd that the accurate description of the situation produced. She said, yes. She said it with the same quality, the quality of someone who was in the same accurate description from the other direction and who was finding the same combination. He said, I want to ask you something. She said, yes, he said. The decision you made, the waiting, she said, yes. He said, 3 months of the waiting, she said, yes, he said, and tonight, she said, yes. He said, tonight was when, she said, tonight was when I decided the waiting had reached its appropriate conclusion. He said, why tonight? She said, the carrier layer analysis, the afternoon's finding. He said, yes, she said, the intentional structure requires the intentional source. The intentional source requires the reconsideration. He said, yes, she said. The finding produced the quality in you that the research problem's most significant moments produce. The full engagement, the genuine presence in the finding's significance. He said, yes, she said, and the managing was present alongside it. He said, yes, she said, the managing present in the moment of the full genuine engagement with the research work's most significant finding. He said, yes, she said, the signal was the clearest it has been. He said, yes, she said. The clearest signal in 3 months arrived in the moment of the most significant research finding. He said, yes, she said, the research work and the managed thing both at the full quality simultaneously. He said, yes, she said. I decided that the waiting had reached its appropriate conclusion. He said, yes. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of the genuine thing present, the 3 months and the managing and the clearer signal and the intentional source and the dome and the specific thing that the appropriate conclusion was producing. She said the carrier layer. He said, yes, she said, the carrier layer carries the signal. The signal is distinct from the carrier. He said, yes. She said, the professional register was the carrier. The managing was the carrier. He said, yes, she said. The signal was she found the word clear. He said, yes, he said, and the signal was always the genuine thing. She said, yes. He said, yes. She said, the Sorvin's perceptual function reads the carrier and the signal simultaneously. The carrier is the form. The signal is the content. He said, yes. She said, I was reading the content for 3 months. He said, yes. She said, the content is what I'm responding to. He said, yes. He said, not the carrier. She said, not the carrier. He said, yes. She said, yes. The dome had the quality of the significant moment's presence, the planet below in the primary viewport, the deep space in the surrounding field, the 2 people in the dome's observation positions in the quality of the thing that the 3 months and the managing and the waiting and the tonight had built. He said the research work tomorrow. She said, yes. He said the intentional sources implications. She said, yes. He said the reconsideration of the preliminary findings characterization. She said, yes, he said. The research work will be the research work. She said, yes. He said, and this. She said, and this. He said, yes. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of the full presence, the perceptual function, and the person, and the 3 months, and the tonight, and the signal that was always the genuine thing. He said, I want to say something about the managing. She said, yes. He said, I managed because the managing was the appropriate form, the cultural distance, and the responsibilities. She said, yes. He said, the managing was not the concealment. The managing was the respect. She said, yes, I know, he said, and the managing made the signal cleaner. She said, yes, he said, yes, he said, I'm glad I managed. She said, yes. He said, not because the managing worked. She said, no. The managing didn't conceal anything. He said, no, because the managing produced the 3 months of the clear signal that you were reading. She said, yes. He said, the 3 months of the clear signal produced the observation. She said, yes, he said. The observation produced the decision to wait. She said, yes. He said, the waiting produced tonight. She said, yes. He said, yes. She said, the managing produced tonight. He said, yes.